In the late 18th century, along a remote stretch of wilderness road in Kentucky, there stood an inn and farm that became known as one of the most horrifying sites of mass murder in early American history. The Harpe brothers, along with their two wives, and eventually their children, operated what appeared to be a humble frontier establishment offering food and lodging to weary travelers. But between 1797 and 1799, this family of killers murdered at least 40 people, possibly many more, making them America's first known serial killers and establishing a legacy of terror that would haunt the Kentucky frontier for generations. This is not just the story of two brutal killers, but of an entire family operation dedicated to robbery, murder, and unspeakable cruelty. It is the story of how the American frontier's isolation and lawlessness created opportunities for predators, how family could normalize the most extreme violence, and how one of the most prolific killing sprees in American history was finally brought to an end through a combination of frontier justice and pure chance. This is the story of the Harpe brothers and their farm of horrors. To understand how such a nightmare could unfold on the American frontier, we must first understand the context of Kentucky in the late 1790s. This was still very much wilderness territory, newly open to white settlement after decades of conflict with Native American tribes who had every right to resist the invasion of their lands. The area was sparsely populated, with small settlements and isolated farms scattered across dense forests and rough terrain. Roads were little more than trails, and travel between settlements was dangerous, taking days or weeks depending on the distance and conditions. Law enforcement in frontier Kentucky was minimal and often ineffective. There were no professional police forces, no forensic investigation techniques, no means of rapid communication between settlements. Justice was largely a matter of community action, with posses formed when crimes were discovered, and punishment often administered on the spot rather than through formal legal proceedings. This environment of isolation and limited law enforcement created opportunities for criminals who were willing to be ruthless and mobile. The Harpe brothers themselves, Micajah, Big Harpe, and Wiley, Little Harpe, were born into this frontier world, though their origins remain somewhat mysterious and disputed. What is known is that they came from a loyalist family during the American Revolution, meaning their family had supported the British Crown against the American revolutionaries. This put them on the losing side of that conflict and may have contributed to their alienation from American society and their willingness to prey upon it. The brothers were large, powerful men, with Big Harpe standing well over 6 feet tall and possessing tremendous physical strength. Contemporary accounts describe them as having wild, unkempt appearances, with long hair and beards, and eyes that witnesses said showed a disturbing lack of normal human emotion or empathy. They dressed in rough frontier clothing and could blend in with other settlers when necessary, but those who encountered them often reported feeling instinctively uneasy in their presence. What made the Harpe brothers unique among early American criminals was not just their brutality, which was extreme even by the violent standards of the frontier, but the fact that they killed seemingly without clear motive. Most frontier violence was related to land disputes, personal feuds, or robbery for specific gain. The Harpes certainly robbed their victims, but they often killed people who had little worth stealing, and frequently murdered in ways that went far beyond what was necessary to rob someone. They appeared to enjoy killing for its own sake, torturing victims before death and mutilating bodies afterward in ways that suggested a psychological pathology that contemporary people had no framework to understand. The Harpes did not work alone. They were accompanied by 2 women who were referred to as their wives, though the relationships were more complex than that term suggests. These women, Susan and Betsey Roberts, were sisters who had apparently been with the Harpes since the late 1780s or early 1790s. The exact nature of their relationships is unclear. Both women seem to be shared by both brothers in some way, and both eventually bore children who could have been fathered by either man. The role of Susan and Betsey in the Harpe killing spree has been debated by historians. Were they willing participants in the murders, accomplices who helped lure victims and dispose of bodies? Were they captives, held through fear and violence, forced to witness and assist in crimes they had no real choice but to participate in? Or were they something in between, women who had become so damaged and twisted by their association with the Harpes that they had lost any normal moral compass? Contemporary accounts, and the women's own later testimonies, suggest a complex picture. They were certainly aware of the murders and helped conceal them. They sometimes helped lure victims by appearing as helpless women in need of assistance, making travelers let down their guard. They helped with the practical logistics of running the farm and inn that served as the base for the killing operation. But they also showed signs of being terrified of the Harpe brothers, of being beaten and abused themselves, and of wanting to escape but feeling unable to do so. The Harpe family's primary base of operations was a farm and inn located along a wilderness road in what is now southeastern Kentucky, near the border with Tennessee. The exact location has been disputed, with different historical accounts placing it in slightly different areas, but what is clear is that it was remote, surrounded by dense forest, and situated on a road that saw regular traffic from travelers moving between settlements. The farm appeared outwardly normal, a rough log cabin that served as both dwelling and inn, with a barn, some cleared land for crops and livestock. Travelers passing through the area would see what looked like a typical frontier homestead and might stop to purchase food, seek lodging for the night, or simply rest their horses. Many of these travelers were never seen again. The Harpe's method was relatively simple but terrifyingly effective. Travelers would stop at the inn, either by choice or because the Harpes or the women would flag them down claiming to need help or offering hospitality. Once the travelers were on the property, the Harpes would wait for an opportune moment, often late at night when the victims were asleep or at least off their guard, and then attack with overwhelming violence. The murders themselves were often grotesquely brutal. The Harpes didn't simply kill people efficiently. They tortured and mutilated them in ways that suggested sadistic pleasure in inflicting suffering. Victims were beaten, stabbed repeatedly, dismembered while still alive, or subjected to other forms of torture that witnesses who later discovered the crime scenes found almost incomprehensible in their cruelty. After the victims were dead, the Harpes would often mutilate the bodies further, sometimes in ways that suggested ritualistic elements or simply random desecration. One particularly horrifying aspect of the Harpe murders was what they did with the bodies. Rather than simply burying victims on the property, which would have been the easiest disposal method, the Harpes often weighted down bodies with stones and threw them into nearby rivers or sinkhole caves. They would cut open the abdomen, fill it with rocks, and then sink the body in water. This method of disposal served two purposes. It concealed the bodies, at least temporarily, and it may have given the Harpes sadistic satisfaction to imagine the bodies sinking into dark water or disappearing into the earth. But the farm operation was only one aspect of the Harpes' killing spree. Unlike many serial killers who have a specific hunting ground, the Harpes were mobile, traveling throughout Kentucky and into Tennessee, Virginia, and other frontier areas. When they weren't operating from their farm, they were on the road, sometimes posing as ordinary travelers, sometimes joining up with other groups for protection or cover, and always looking for opportunities to rob and kill. During their mobile periods, the Harpes' victims included solitary travelers encountered on remote stretches of road, killed for whatever possessions they carried, and sometimes apparently just for the satisfaction of killing. Small groups of travelers, ambushed when they camped for the night, with entire families sometimes murdered, including children. People who had made the mistake of showing the Harpes hospitality invited them to share a camp or meal, only to be killed once the Harpes had gained their trust. Even other criminals and outlaws, as the Harpes had no loyalty even to people who might have been considered their peers in the frontier underworld. The death toll from the Harpes' mobile operations is impossible to determine with certainty. Bodies were found scattered across hundreds of miles of frontier territory, often in advanced states of decomposition, making identification difficult or impossible. Some victims were never found at all, having been disposed of in rivers or caves or left in such remote locations that they were consumed by animals before anyone discovered them. Conservative estimates suggest the Harpes killed at least 40 people, but some historians believe the true number could be considerably higher, possibly exceeding 100 victims. What made the Harpe family particularly terrifying to frontier communities was the randomness and motivelessness of many of their killings. A wealthy traveler carrying money and valuables might be an understandable target for robbers, even if the murder was condemned. But the Harpes killed poor travelers who had nothing worth stealing. They killed children and babies who were obviously no threat. They killed people who had helped them or shown them kindness. They seemed to kill simply because they could, because they enjoyed it, because violence was their natural state of being. One incident that became infamous throughout the frontier involved the Harpes murdering a man, his wife, and their 4 children, ranging from an infant to a teenager, who had offered them shelter for the night during a storm. The family had fed them, given them warm places to sleep, and treated them with frontier hospitality. In the middle of the night, the Harpes arose and systematically murdered the entire family with axes, killing even the infant in its cradle. They then robbed the cabin of what little of value it contained and burned it to the ground, leaving the bodies inside. This murder had no justification even by the twisted logic of criminal violence. It was pure evil. Another horrifying incident involved one of the Harpe brothers' own children. According to accounts that later emerged, one of the infants being carried by Susan or Betsey began crying persistently while the family was traveling, making noise that the Harpes feared would attract attention. Rather than try to soothe the baby or wait for it to quiet down, Big Harpe reportedly grabbed the infant and smashed its head against a tree, killing it instantly, then threw the small body into the woods. Whether this incident actually occurred or was exaggeration by horrified witnesses and storytellers is unclear, but it was widely believed on the frontier and contributed to the perception of the Harpes as monsters rather than merely criminals. The 2 women who traveled with the Harpes, Susan and Betsey Roberts, lived through years of this horror, witnessing and sometimes participating in dozens of murders. What must that experience have done to them psychologically? How did they maintain any semblance of normal human functioning while living daily with men who killed casually and brutally, who showed no mercy even to children, who had apparently no conscience or empathy whatsoever? The women's later testimonies, given after the Harpes were finally stopped, provide some insight into their experiences and mental states. They described living in constant fear, never knowing when the Harpes' violence might turn on them. They described being beaten and sexually abused, being threatened with death if they tried to leave, or if they failed to cooperate with the murders and disposal of bodies. They described becoming numb to the violence, learning to dissociate from what they witnessed, developing a psychological distance from the horrors happening around them as a survival mechanism. But they also admitted to having helped lure victims, to having watched murders without trying to intervene or warn victims, to having assisted in disposing of bodies and covering up evidence. Whether this made them guilty accomplices or traumatized victims who had been coerced into complicity, or some combination of both, is a question that troubled frontier communities then and troubles historians now. The legal and moral frameworks of 1798 didn't have good ways to categorize or judge their situations. The Harpe's reign of terror couldn't continue indefinitely. As the body count rose and stories of disappearances along certain roads and near certain locations accumulated, frontier communities began to suspect that something more than random misfortune was at work. Posses were formed to hunt for bandits and murderers. Warnings were spread about the dangers of traveling alone or stopping at unknown establishments. And slowly, a picture began to emerge of two large, rough men, sometimes accompanied by women and children, who seemed to be connected to multiple disappearances and murders. The breakthrough in identifying the Harpes came when they made a crucial mistake. In the summer of 1798, they killed a man named William Love near Knoxville, Tennessee. Love's body was found relatively quickly, and witnesses reported having seen two men matching the Harpe's description in the area around the time of the murder. A posse was formed and tracked the suspects, eventually catching up with them at an isolated cabin. In the confrontation that followed, the Harpes and their women were captured, though the brothers fought violently and had to be subdued by force. They were taken to the Knoxville jail to await trial for the murder of William Love. This should have been the end of the Harpe terror. They were in custody, there were witnesses connecting them to at least one murder, and frontier justice in such cases was usually swift and final. But the Knoxville jail was not secure by modern standards. It was essentially a rough wooden structure with inadequate locks and minimal guarding. The Harpes, being large and strong men with nothing to lose, managed to break out of the jail, escaping into the wilderness with Susan and Betsey, who were being held in a separate part of the jail and were somehow able to escape with them or were broken out by the brothers. The escape enraged the frontier communities and created a sense of urgency about capturing the Harpes before they could kill again. But the frontier was vast, and the Harpes knew it well. They disappeared into the wilderness, and for several months there was no sign of them. Then the murders resumed. Bodies began appearing again, killed in the signature Harpe style: extreme brutality, torture, mutilation, disposal in rivers or caves. The Harpes were back to their killing, and they seemed even more reckless than before, perhaps emboldened by their successful escape or perhaps pushed beyond caution by the knowledge that they were now hunted men with nothing left to lose. But their time was running out. In August of 1799, about a year after their escape from the Knoxville jail, the Harpes made a fatal error. They murdered a well-liked settler named Moses Stegall, along with his wife and child, while Stegall was away from his cabin. When Stegall returned and found his family dead, he was devastated and furious. He immediately organized a posse of neighbors and began tracking the killers. Stegall's posse picked up the Harpes' trail and pursued them relentlessly. The chase continued for several days, with the Harpes fleeing on horseback but slowed by the presence of Susan and Betsey and the children. The posse was gaining ground and the Harpes knew it. At some point during the chase, the brothers apparently decided that the women and children were slowing them down too much. In a decision that reveals their absolute lack of human feeling even toward their own family, they abandoned Susan and Betsey and the children, leaving them behind while the brothers tried to escape alone. The posse found the women and children first, exhausted and terrified, abandoned in the wilderness. The women, recognizing that the Harpes had left them to whatever fate awaited them, and perhaps seeing an opportunity to finally escape the nightmare they had been living, told the posse everything. They confirmed that the men they were chasing were indeed the Harpe brothers. They detailed murders the brothers had committed. They described the farm operation and the mobile killing spree, and they told the posse which direction the brothers had fled. With this information and with the Harpes now slowed by injuries sustained in the flight and by their horses tiring, the posse closed in. On August 24, 1799, they caught up with Big Harpe. What happened next has become legendary in frontier history, a story that was told and retold across Kentucky and Tennessee for generations. The posse surrounded Big Harpe, and there was a brief but violent confrontation. Several men fired on Big Harpe, and he was hit multiple times, suffering wounds that were clearly fatal but which did not immediately kill him. He fell from his horse, badly wounded and unable to flee further. The posse dismounted and approached him as he lay dying. Moses Stegall, the man whose wife and child Big Harpe had murdered, was the first to reach him. What followed was an act of frontier justice that was brutal, but which the men involved felt was deserved given the enormity of Big Harpe's crimes. Stegall drew his knife and, while Big Harpe was still alive and conscious, began to cut off his head. Historical accounts describe Big Harpe remaining conscious during the initial part of this horrifying execution, allegedly saying his only regret was the murder of one of the women's children, the incident where he had reportedly killed a crying infant by smashing it against a tree. Whether he actually expressed this specific regret or whether this detail was added later by storytellers is unclear. But what is certain is that Moses Stegall decapitated Big Harpe, cutting off his head while he was still alive. This brutal act was not random sadism by the posse, but rather a deliberate choice that served several purposes in the context of frontier justice. First, it ensured that Big Harpe was definitely dead and could never escape or survive his wounds to kill again. Second, it provided proof that he had been killed, as his head could be displayed as evidence. Third, and perhaps most importantly to the men of the posse, it was retribution that felt proportionate to Big Harpe's crimes. He had killed with extreme brutality and had shown no mercy to his victims, including children. Therefore, he would die brutally and without mercy. The posse took Big Harpe's head and placed it on a stake at a crossroads near where he was killed. This location became known as Harpe's Head, a name that persisted for generations and which served as a grim warning to other outlaws and as a reassurance to settlers that one of the most feared killers on the frontier had been brought to justice. The head remained on display until it decomposed, a macabre landmark that travelers would point out to each other. But while Big Harpe had been stopped, his brother Little Harpe had escaped. The posse had been so focused on Big Harpe that Little Harpe had managed to slip away during the confrontation, disappearing into the wilderness. For a time, there was fear that Little Harpe would continue the killing spree alone, but he seemed to understand that his time as a frontier serial killer was over. He had lost his brother, his women had been captured and were talking to authorities, his base of operations was known, and every lawman and posse in the region would be looking for him. Little Harpe went underground, abandoning the Harpe name and trying to blend into frontier society under assumed identities. For several years, he apparently managed to avoid detection, possibly leaving the Kentucky-Tennessee area altogether and relocating to other frontier regions. He may have continued criminal activities, but if so, he was careful enough not to attract the attention that would connect him to the Harpe name. Little Harpe's story came to an end in 1804, 5 years after Big Harpe's death. He had apparently joined up with a river pirate gang operating along the Mississippi River, near the borders of what are now Mississippi, Louisiana, and Arkansas. River piracy was a significant problem on the frontier at this time, with gangs ambushing boats, killing crew and passengers, and stealing cargo. The gang Little Harpe had joined was led by a notorious criminal named Samuel Mason. Little Harpe, going under an assumed name, was part of this gang for some time. But eventually, probably due to a combination of greed and desperation, he and another gang member murdered Samuel Mason, apparently with the idea of claiming a reward that had been offered for Mason's capture. They cut off Mason's head. Perhaps little Harpe remembered how his brother's head had been displayed, and took it to authorities to claim the reward. But someone recognized little Harpe despite his assumed identity, and instead of receiving a reward, he was arrested as Wiley Harpe, wanted for multiple murders. He was tried, convicted, and executed by hanging in February of 1804. His head, like his brother's, was cut off after death and displayed publicly as proof that the last of the Harpe brothers had been brought to justice. With both Harpe brothers dead, the question remained of what to do with Susan and Betsey Roberts and their children. The women had been captured when the brothers abandoned them, and they had cooperated with authorities, providing testimony about the murders they had witnessed and participated in. The legal system of frontier Kentucky and Tennessee struggled with how to handle their cases. On one hand, the women had clearly been involved in the murders, helping to lure victims, assisting in disposal of bodies, and failing to report crimes or try to rescue victims. Under the law, this made them accomplices to murder, potentially subject to execution themselves. On the other hand, there was sympathy for their situation as women who had been under the control of violent, abusive men, who had been threatened with death if they tried to escape or refused to cooperate, and who had themselves been victims of violence and sexual abuse. After much deliberation and debate, authorities decided not to prosecute the women for murder. They were briefly jailed, more for their own protection and to ensure their availability for testimony than as punishment, and were then released. What happened to them after this is not entirely clear from historical records. Some accounts suggest they returned to their family in North Carolina, trying to rebuild normal lives far from the scenes of the horrors they had experienced. Other accounts suggest they remained in frontier areas, possibly remarrying and starting new families under different names. The children who had been with the Harpe family, at least some of whom had been fathered by the Harpe brothers, were placed with relatives or adopted by other families. Their fates are largely unknown, though there are occasional mentions in historical documents of people claiming to be descendants of the Harpe brothers, usually with a mixture of shame and dark fascination at their ancestry. The farm and inn where the Harpes had conducted much of their killing was thoroughly searched after their deaths. Investigators found evidence of numerous murders, bloodstains, discarded belongings of victims, bones in a ravine where bodies had been thrown. The property was eventually abandoned, as no one wanted to live on land where so many had died. The buildings fell into ruin, and the forest reclaimed the land. For generations, the area was considered cursed or haunted, and locals avoided it when possible. The legacy of the Harpe brothers and their family-killing operation extended far beyond the immediate aftermath of their deaths. They became legendary figures in American criminal history, examples of the darkest possibilities of human nature and the dangers of the lawless frontier. Stories about the Harpes were told and retold, often exaggerated but based on a core of terrible truth. In the years and decades after their deaths, the Harpe brothers were the subject of numerous books, pamphlets, and newspaper articles. Some of these accounts were relatively factual, based on court records and witness testimonies. Others were sensationalized, embellished with invented details and melodramatic flourishes designed to shock and titillate readers. The truth about the Harpes was horrible enough, but storytellers often felt compelled to add extra layers of horror, creating a legend that was even darker than the reality. The Harpe case is historically significant for several reasons, beyond the sheer number of victims and the brutality of the murders. First, they are generally recognized by historians and criminologists as America's first documented serial killers, predating more famous cases like Jack the Ripper by nearly a century. Their pattern of repeated murder, their apparent psychological motivation beyond simple robbery or revenge, and the family operation they created all mark them as a unique and early example of a phenomenon that would unfortunately recur throughout American history. Second, the Harpe case highlighted the challenges of law enforcement and justice in frontier America. The vast distances, sparse population, limited communication, and weak formal legal institutions created an environment where criminals could operate with relative impunity if they were mobile and willing to be violent. The Harpes literally got away with murder for years, killing dozens of people across multiple territories, because there was no effective system for coordinating investigation and pursuit across jurisdictional boundaries. The eventual capture and killing of the Harpe brothers was not the result of professional law enforcement, but rather frontier vigilante justice. Moses Stegall's posse operated outside formal legal channels, pursuing, capturing, and executing Big Harpe without trial. This kind of rough justice was common on the frontier, and was often the only practical way to deal with violent criminals in areas where formal courts and jails were distant or non-existent. But it also raised questions about due process, the rule of law, and the dangers of mob justice that would persist throughout American history. Third, the Harpe case illustrated the particular vulnerability of travelers and isolated settlers in frontier areas. The people the Harpes killed were often those who were most vulnerable: travelers on lonely roads, small families in isolated cabins, people who had no one nearby to hear their screams or come to their aid. The Harpes exploited the hospitality customs of the frontier, using people's generosity and trust against them. This created a culture of fear and suspicion that persisted long after the Harpes were dead, making frontier communities more closed and defensive. Fourth, the involvement of Susan and Betsey Roberts in the Harpe crimes raised difficult questions about complicity, victimization, and the limits of coercion as a defense for criminal participation. Were these women guilty accomplices who deserved punishment, or were they victims themselves, held through violence and fear, and forced to participate in crimes they would never have committed freely? These questions have no easy answers and continue to be debated by legal scholars and historians. The Harpe case also had lasting impact on American culture and folklore. The image of the dangerous frontier, of isolated farms and inns where travelers might be murdered, of families of killers operating in the wilderness. These became recurring themes in American Gothic literature and later in horror films. The Harpes influenced depictions of frontier violence in dime novels, in pulp fiction, and eventually in movies and television shows. They became archetypes of frontier evil, their story told and retold with varying degrees of accuracy but consistent horror. In the 20th century, as criminology developed as a professional discipline, the Harpe case attracted attention from researchers trying to understand the psychology of serial killers and the dynamics of criminal families. Why did the Harpe brothers kill? What combination of heredity, environment, and individual psychology created such monsters? Were they psychopaths who lacked normal empathy and moral constraints? Were they products of a particularly brutal frontier environment that normalized violence? Were there traumatic experiences in their early lives that damaged them psychologically? These questions are difficult to answer with certainty given the limited and often unreliable historical record. We have no detailed psychological profiles of the Harpes, no childhood histories, no way to diagnose them using modern psychiatric categories. What we have are their actions and the testimony of people who knew them, which consistently describe men who killed casually and brutally, who showed no remorse or empathy, and who seemed to enjoy inflicting suffering. Modern psychological research on serial killers suggests that most have some combination of genetic predisposition toward violence, early childhood trauma or abuse, and environmental factors that fail to teach normal empathy and moral behavior. It's plausible that all of these factors were present for the Harpe brothers. Coming from a loyalist family during the Revolution may have exposed them to violence and dislocation in their early years. Growing up on the violent frontier may have normalized brutality, and they may have had some underlying psychological or neurological differences that made them less capable of normal emotional connections. But ultimately, the Harpe brothers remain mysterious in their motivations and psychology. They killed on a scale that was unusual even for the violent frontier, and they killed in ways that suggested they enjoyed it, rather than seeing it as merely instrumental to robbery or other goals. They were, by any reasonable definition, evil men who caused tremendous suffering and who deserved the violent ends they met. The question of what happened to the Harpe farm and the other sites where their crimes occurred has fascinated people for generations. The actual farm location, as mentioned earlier, was abandoned and allowed to fall into ruin. Over the years, treasure hunters and morbidly curious people have searched the area, looking for graves or for valuables the Harpes might have buried. Some bones and artifacts have been found over the years, though whether they are connected to the Harpes or are simply the normal remnants of frontier life is often unclear. The location known as Harpe's Head, where Big Harpe's severed head was displayed, became a landmark and eventually a tourist site of sorts. The crossroads is in what is now Webster County, Kentucky, and there is a historical marker at the approximate location. Over the years, people have reported strange occurrences in the area: sounds of screaming, apparitions of large men on horseback, sensations of being watched or followed. Whether these reports are genuine paranormal phenomena, the products of suggestion and imagination, or simply the effects of knowing the area's terrible history is impossible to say. Other sites connected to the Harpes have also been preserved or marked. The location where Little Harpe was hanged is marked in what is now Mississippi. Some of the caves and sinkholes where the Harpes disposed of bodies have been explored by historians and amateur investigators, with occasional discoveries of bones that might be connected to their victims. Roads the Harpes traveled and places they were known to have committed murders have become part of regional history and folklore. In recent decades, there have been efforts to create a more comprehensive and accurate historical record of the Harpe brothers and their crimes. Historians have combed through court records, newspaper accounts, personal letters and diaries from the period, and other primary sources to separate fact from legend. This research has confirmed many of the basic facts of the Harpe case, while debunking some of the more sensational stories that had grown up around them. One finding of modern research is that the Harpes were probably not quite as prolific as the most extreme estimates suggested. While earlier accounts sometimes credited them with more than 100 murders, more careful analysis suggests the actual number was probably between 40 and 60, with 40 being a fairly solid minimum based on documented cases. This is still an enormous number and makes them among the most prolific serial killers in American history, but it's somewhat less than the most sensational claims. Modern research has also provided more context about the frontier environment that produced the Harpes and that they exploited. The late 1790s were a particularly chaotic time in frontier Kentucky and Tennessee. The area had only recently been opened to white settlement, and formal legal and governmental institutions were still being established. There were ongoing conflicts with Native American tribes who were resisting displacement. There were land disputes and feuds among settlers. There were gangs of bandits and river pirates. Into this environment of violence and instability, the Harpes fit in more easily than they would have in a more settled and law-abiding region. The Harpe case has also been examined through the lens of gender studies and the history of women in crime. The involvement of Susan and Betsey Roberts raises important questions about women's agency and victimization in extreme circumstances. Modern analysis tends to see them as complex figures who were simultaneously victims and participants, women whose choices were severely constrained by their circumstances, but who nonetheless made choices that contributed to terrible crimes. Some feminist scholars have pointed to the Roberts sisters as examples of how women in abusive relationships can become complicit in their abusers' crimes, how trauma can lead to moral corruption, and how societies often struggle to know how to judge women who participate in violence under coercion. Their story has been used to inform contemporary understanding of domestic violence, coercive control, and the complex psychology of abuse victims. The Harpe Brothers story has also been incorporated into broader discussions about violence in American culture and history. Some scholars see the Harpes as emblematic of a particularly American kind of violence, connected to frontier expansion, to the displacement of native peoples, to the lack of effective legal institutions, and to a cultural valorization of rugged individualism that could shade into lawlessness. Others see them as exceptional monsters whose crimes say more about individual pathology than about American culture as a whole. What is not disputed is that the Harpe case remains one of the most horrifying chapters in American criminal history. The image of a family operation dedicated to mass murder, of children growing up in an environment of constant killing, of a farm that appeared normal but concealed dozens of graves, of men who killed casually and brutally without apparent remorse. These images have haunted the American imagination for more than 2 centuries. In the small towns and rural areas of Kentucky and Tennessee where the Harpes operated, their memory is still very much alive. Local historians maintain records and give talks about the Harpes. Historical societies preserve artifacts and documents connected to the case. Descendants of the Harpes' victims, and even alleged descendants of the Harpes themselves, still live in the region and carry the weight of this history. There have been occasional proposals to create museums or more extensive historical sites related to the Harpes, but these have generally been controversial. Some people believe that the Harpe story is important history that should be preserved and taught. Others feel that creating tourist attractions around mass murder is ghoulish and disrespectful to the victims. This tension between historical preservation and ethical concerns about sensationalizing violence continues to shape how the Harpe case is remembered and presented. As we reflect on the story of the Harpe brothers more than 220 years after their crimes, several themes and lessons emerge that remain relevant today. First, the case demonstrates that serial killing and family-based criminal operations are not modern phenomena but have deep historical roots. The patterns of behavior shown by the Harpes, the lack of empathy, the enjoyment of cruelty, the ability to kill repeatedly without remorse, are patterns that have recurred throughout history in different contexts. Second, the case illustrates the critical importance of effective law enforcement and judicial systems. The Harpes were able to kill so many people for so long largely because the frontier legal system was inadequate to the task of detecting, pursuing, and stopping mobile criminals. Their eventual capture and death came not through professional law enforcement, but through frontier vigilantism, which was effective in this instance, but which represented a form of rough justice that had its own problems and dangers. Third, the Harpe case reminds us of the particular vulnerability of travelers and isolated people, and the importance of systems and communities that protect vulnerable individuals. The Harpes' victims were often people who were alone, far from help, trusting of others because frontier survival often required cooperation and mutual aid. Creating societies where vulnerable people are protected requires both formal institutions and cultural norms that prioritize looking out for others. Fourth, the involvement of Susan and Betsey Roberts in the Harpe crimes highlights the complex questions about complicity, victimization, and moral responsibility that arise in cases of coercive control and abusive relationships. These questions remain difficult today, as legal systems and societies continue to struggle with how to judge people who participate in crimes under various degrees of coercion or duress. Finally, the Harpe case serves as a reminder that human beings are capable of extraordinary evil, that there are people who will kill without remorse or apparent reason, and that societies must be organized in ways that can identify and stop such people before they accumulate large numbers of victims. The 40 or more people murdered by the Harpes were individuals with families, dreams, and lives ahead of them. Their deaths were tragedies that might have been prevented if effective systems had been in place. The farm of horrors is gone, reclaimed by forest and time. The Harpe brothers are long dead, their heads having been displayed as warnings before decomposing into skulls and finally dust. Susan and Betsey Roberts vanished into history, their final fates unknown. But the memory of what happened in Kentucky in 1797–1799 remains, preserved in historical records, in local folklore, in the historical markers that dot the landscape, and in the ongoing fascination with one of America's first and most prolific families of serial killers. As we remember the Harpe brothers and their farm of horrors, we honor the memory of their victims, the travelers who stopped at what they thought was a safe inn and never left alive, the families murdered in their own homes, the individuals who met the Harpes on remote roads and disappeared forever. We remember so that such things might be prevented in the future, so that the isolated and vulnerable might be protected, and so that the darkness of which humans are capable is not forgotten or minimized. The story of the Harpe brothers stands as a testament to both the worst of human nature and to the rough frontier justice that eventually brought them down. It is American history at its darkest, a story that reminds us that the frontier was not always a place of heroic adventure, but was sometimes a place of horrifying violence, where monsters could hide among the settlers, and where the normal rules of civilized society were often absent or ineffective. May the victims be remembered, may the lessons be learned, and may such horrors never be repeated.